So we're not going to waste any more time on this cold listen hot take. I am going to go ahead and pull up the clock as we speak. Are you guys ready to beat the clock and talk?
It's like
I'm
a
ready.
game show. All right.
All right. We're going to start the clock right now. Matt, initial thoughts.
I love this. This was a fantastic listen. I was very surprised how different everything kind of was. That, you know, it's almost like two different sides. I mean, there's only 4 songs, and so they're very long, so I didn't know exactly what I was going to get, but I really enjoyed it. I heard the first track right off the bat. I thought, you know, Walk On By, I thought of Trip Hop and Portishead, which I found very interesting because, you know, for like a 1960s kind of album in 1969, I'm going, damn, I could see Portishead doing something like this. But great funk stuff. Wah Wah. The second track was very funky. The third song sounded like a Dusty Springfield kind of crooner song. The fourth track, I could have done a little bit. I mean, it's the first 9 minutes is basically him talking about telling a story about the song that he's about to sing, almost like a preacher with the organ in the background.
Well, he's setting the stage, Matt.
Yeah,
he
really
is, and I don't mind setting the stage. It was a little bit too long, but I got to say, there's that song, and the overall theme I got from this is how wonderful everything built. Like, there were lots of parts where it started off and, you know, slower, less instrumentation, and then it just started to build to more of a crescendo. And I love that in music in general, and I found that to be all over the place, often, sometimes multiple times within the same songs. So I really like this. This was a big surprise, and I'm a huge fan.
Gotcha. How about you, Josh?
Yeah, I really like this album also. I'm surprised it's not in the top 100 that we've talked about on other shows. I really liked it. It reminded me of blaxploitation music or a soundtrack to one of those types of films. I can just imagine myself walking down the street to this, like the Shaft theme song, and feeling badass. I love the like Matt said, I love that guitar wah-wah in the hyperbolic song. I'm wondering if that title, if Outkast's album Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music is a reference to that album, maybe, or that song.
Good catch, Josh. That's a good catch. Yeah, we'll have to look that up.
I love the piano solo in that song as well.
Yeah.
This whole album overall felt like a cousin to a lot of the free jazz that we've listened to.
You read my mind, Josh.
yeah.
I thought the same thing. Yep.
I don't know how, you know, improvised this album was or not, but it seemed like it could go all over the place, and each musician got a chance to shine. Maybe I love the, you know, as characteristic of soul, I love that, like that beat in the background and that bass. That's great. And like Matt said too, I like that how it's split between the 4 songs, and on that it's more romantic on, like, I would say, on the back half, and you think that one woman song is going to be way more romantic, except it's about cheating and which woman he's going to go with and choose, and that's a nice little, like, funny coincidence. Or not.
And then you get the 4th song, which is basically a lament for being treated poorly by a woman and ending up in the opposite side of the relationship, which is fascinating.
Yeah, the 4th song is probably my least favorite, just because it does build a little too long, in my opinion. I wonder who Tyrone Davis is too. That was mentioned in the song. And yeah,
better call Tyrone. Maybe that's another reference right there for Erykah Badu.
Yeah. Oh yeah, nice. And I just like the overall feel of this album. It's just so smooth, and his voice. We haven't talked about his voice. He's got that sultry, like, deep voice that's so great to listen to. They call it baby making music for a reason, and that's definitely this album.
Yeah, and we've still got plenty of time, so I like this album a whole lot too. I looked at this album as the cousin of so many different styles of music that we've listened. The first thing I couldn't help but think, like Josh just said, is this is almost like a jazz album, just with different instrumentation. So bass lines, the piano is played in a different way than the jazz that we've listened to. There's a bunch of brass throughout this album. There's saxophone parts, horn parts, and then Isaac Hayes' voice itself is an instrument in its own way. And he even is placed into the music like sounds are placed into a jazz album. So it actually has, I think, while it doesn't sound the same, and we seem to like it more than we did the Pharoah Sanders album, I do really think they were released the same year, and I think that in many ways they're speaking to the same sort of idea of deconstructing some of the more formal stuff that was in the charts or considered to be part of their genres. And in Isaac Hayes' case, I think it's a little bit of R&B, a little bit of soul. There is a little bit of a connection to James Brown, and I know James Brown was making this type of music during this time as well. We covered a different era of James Brown earlier, but so it has a little bit of James Brown in it, but it's a sexier James Brown, not as explosive a James Brown. Like the dynamic bursts. Isaac Hayes takes his time musically, his lyrics, even just to get his voice into it. So and it also it's a cousin to like the soul and R&B music that was in the 60s, but this it comes from a different spot. It's sexier, it's to some degree darker than Motown, right? It portends almost like the type of lyrical content and the feel that you get from Marvin Gaye albums in the 70s, even though Marvin Gaye wasn't doing soul. It really is a fascinating album. I imagine when it came out in 1969, and I always hear so many people talk about how much they love both Isaac Hayes and this album, and it makes total sense now because it seems both timeless and interesting when you put it in the context of its time. So let me ask you guys about the musicianship. Since there's a lot of different instruments playing, what really stood out to either of you guys? We talked a little bit about the piano, but Matt, how about you? What instrumentation stood out to you?
I think in some ways, just everything stood out in one way, shape, or form at different times. Josh mentioned the piano. There's like a piano solo on, was it the second track, right? Anybody want to try to take a gander?
Yep. Hyperbolic syllabesque daily mystic. There we go. That's what we're going for.
Okay. So track 2, the piano solo on that was great. I really liked that. The wah-wah pedal, the wah-wah guitar at the beginning stood out. The bass certainly stood out. Several parts. I heard the drums, certainly the horns. The female background singers were really good too. I thought particularly on one woman, I thought that the way that they were hitting, it was almost like staccato notes, like very, very, I don't want to say sharp, but very short, like biting, vocals that were almost kind of like part of the percussion, that they were so short and they just stopped. And it really helped emphasize the rhythm of the song. And I thought that was great too. But a lot of the instrumentation stood out just at different times. And I thought that it blended. It was a very, very good use of all of the instruments at different times. And it was just the variety, and that helped it be a little bit more, helped the variety a little bit more throughout the album, which kept it more interesting, I think.
Yeah, and you didn't even talk about the brass on Walk On By, which is all over that track, the first track of the album. It's a 4-track album for those that are trying to follow along with us. So how about you, Josh? Any instrumentation stand out in any of the specific songs?
Well, I was going to say there's high production values all around. You can tell that this is a meticulously crafted album. The horns definitely stood out to me. I always appreciate horns on an album, when they're used well, and this album's no exception. There is some on the last song. There's like a weird, almost like harmonium or some sort of harpsichord or some like electronic maybe piano at the end or something. I noticed that. Always the bass was prevalent throughout. Those are the things that stood out for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of distorted playing of multiple instruments on both track 4 and track 1 is one thing that I noticed, and you don't hear that a lot in the way that it's used in the music we've covered so far. There's some of it in like the Stooges and MC5 album that Matt and I covered, but you don't hear it too often, and certainly not in R&B and soul music. You're not really hearing it, and I know that becomes a hallmark later of. We did hear it a little bit on Sly and the Family Stone too, who's another. It's impossible to not talk about this album without talking about that album, because once again they're both 1969, but they're doing funk in very different ways. I feel like Sly and the Family Stone is playing to the grandstand, where Isaac Hayes is like playing to you directly, if that makes sense. How about, I know, Matt, you say you're not normally a lyrics guy, and I wouldn't necessarily say this is lyrics music that you really need to understand, but you definitely, when Isaac Hayes comes in, he's designed to be listened to in these tracks. In 1, 2, and 3, it's sort of like as an instrument. And in 4, as you mentioned, he gives almost a 9-minute narrative before the other 9 minutes, which is the song itself as a lament. Did you pay attention to the lyrics on this one, Matt, or was it still just impress the music first and foremost?
No, I did. I think with these listens, I'm going to listen to the lyrics more because it's more of a. I'm giving one listen and then I got to talk about it, right? So I'm listening more intently with in these segments than I do under normal circumstances. But yes, having said that, I think I would understand lyrics more if artists took the first 9 minutes to talk about the song and and introduce it, and then I'd be like, oh, okay, now I know what the song's about. So I don't have to interpret
damn well
anything
sound
'cause
like
I'm an
Isaac
idiot.
Hayes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true too. Actually, that kind of reminded me. You know that live version of The River with Springsteen does like that long intro about his dad and stuff like that. I was kind of reminded a little of that with this. But no, I definitely got the lyrics, and they're fairly straightforward. It's not, if you're just listening, it's not too hard to figure out. Obviously, a lot of this is all about love, right? Mostly in the negative, right? Because it's about loss. It's about cheating. It's about leaving someone. It wasn't hard for me to follow that.
The
Gotcha.
music is the lyrics and music are so intentional. The music doesn't drown out the lyrics on this album. It's very easy to follow, and with Isaac Hayes' voice, you kind of get soothed or lulled into listening to the story.
Yeah, and there's no dichotomous music that takes you, fools you a little bit in terms of what's being talked about, like sometimes happens in other types of music. This is like, as you're listening to the music, you kind of get the idea of what the lyrical content, at least in terms of tone, is going to be, and then you just see sort of how Isaac Hayes takes it. And like I said before, the cool thing is, I think no matter what your experience, with love is, if you're someone who has a ton of heartbreaks or married your high school sweetheart or everything in between, these songs can, even if you can't relate to the direct narrative, these songs sort of speak and sound to universal truths and feelings, if that makes sense. So we are now at the 3-minute and 30-second mark. I want to kind of leave a little bit of time for last reflections, what you would tell someone who has not listened to this album, who may not be familiar with either this genre of music or Isaac Hayes in general. Let's flip it this time. Josh, why don't you start? What would you say?
Final thoughts. So I would like to point out that first song is a cover of the song Walk On By. I caught that and was singing that version in my head when I realized it. I would say that this is a great entry point to soul if you don't have any experience with it. It is accessible for sure. I think anyone can listen to this and enjoy it. Like a lot of the albums that we've talked about, there's not a high hurdle to get into it.
Do you consider this soul or funk or soul funk?
Good question. I'd say probably a combination, but more soul than funk. I think it's not as I think of funk as a little bit more faster paced. So yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's great.
How about you, Matt? Because I know you came in being a little bit surprised you liked this album as much as you did.
Well, I think I was just surprised because of the variety. And I would say this is half funk and half soul. I mean, because those first two tracks, even though I see what you're saying, Josh, but I don't. Funk is more of the sound as opposed to the speed for me, and you don't have to be. It doesn't have to be fast for it to kind of get that groove. But I also would recommend this as like an entry point. I think there's a lot of different genres that this is drawing upon, and it's very catchy, right? And this is not a hard listen, I don't think, for most people. I'm here, like you said, there's the R&B, there's the funk, there's the jazz. Although the free jazz, I think it's kind of interesting that you guys brought that up, and I know we don't have a ton of time to talk about it, but I don't really see this as free jazz because this is everything's grounded in something, right? There's always that bass and the drum line in the background that's keeping. Mm-hmm. So this is not an Eric Dolphy type jazz thing that I'm hearing. This is much more grounded.
But remember, Pharoah Sanders is considered free jazz too, and wouldn't you see some similarities?
In the more grounded stuff of Pharoah Sanders, but Pharoah Sanders also goes off into the jungle and all these noises and kind of cacophony, right? Where this stays within the bounds of a structure. This is great. I'm listening to this more, man. And it's funny because it just missed I'm looking at it. It's 108 in the 1960s. He has another album that's 102 in the 70s. He's got one that's 115 in the 70s. So we're just missing Isaac Hayes. But I'm glad we got to hear it here because this is a very good album.
Okay, perfect. And we're at the 1 minute mark, so I'll give my final thoughts right now. Great album. he's probably one of my favorites we've covered, and just for reference sake, we're at around episode 19 right now as we're taping this in terms of our regular shows. But I think it's a top tenner for me so far in terms of albums we've covered. It's an easy listen. It can be right front and center and the thing that you're paying attention to, or it can be put in the background and be very, very pleasant in the background as well while you still notice it. The instrumentation and the varied nature of the instrumentation is great. As Josh mentioned, the horns always stand out to me. I'm like Matt, that funk to me is not the speed, but it's really the bass guitar and how it's played.
Yeah,
is kind of the sound for me, a little bit mixed with the voice coming
the
in.
wah wah too,
and the production is fantastic. So strong recommend. Glad we did it, and that is actually the buzzer for us.